In the heart of a blizzard, a Marine fights not the enemy, but death itself, with a child's life depending on his next breath. A lost girl, an injured soldier, and a loyal German shepherd, strangers brought together by fate and tested by fire and ice. In that frozen silence, they discovered something greater than survival, the miracle of faith, love, and second chances. If this story touches your heart, tell us your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories of courage, compassion, and God's quiet miracles. The wind screamed across the frozen plain outside Bozeman, Montana, a ghostly voice dragging shards of ice against the windows of a lonely gas station. The snow had fallen without pause for hours, turning the road into a white river of silence. Under the flickering neon sign that read, "Valley Fuel and Go," a man in a military parka knelt beside an aging pickup truck that coughed and died with every turn of the key. Ethan Cole's breath came out in sharp, white bursts. He was 30, tall, and built like the kind of man who had learned to carry too much weight for too long. His face was all angles, square jawline, short dark beard, a scar like a pale thread cutting across his cheek from ear to mouth. His eyes were gray, the color of steel beneath overcast skies, steady but tired. Once those eyes had scanned battlefields through desert heat. Now they searched for warmth in a world that had forgotten his name. Beside him sat Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd with thick gray-black fur and intelligent amber eyes that never left his master's side. The dog had been with Ethan since his last tour in Syria, a K9 trained for search and rescue. There was a faint limp in Shadow's right hind leg, a scar from an explosion that had nearly taken them both. In Shadow's gaze, there was the same quiet ache Ethan carried, the kind only those who had seen too much could understand. Ethan slammed the truck door shut and cursed softly under his breath. The tank was nearly empty, the engine frozen stiff, and the cold was crawling through his gloves like a living thing. He looked at the gas station, its yellow light pulsing weakly through the snowstorm, and decided to step inside. The bell above the door jingled weakly as he entered. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, oil, and the faint sweetness of old candy. Shelves stood half empty, and behind the counter, a woman looked up from a newspaper. Darlene Walker, in her late 50s, had hair the color of ashes pulled back into a bun, and a face softened by years but hardened around the eyes. Her red cashier vest was faded, and her wedding ring caught the light each time she adjusted her glasses. "Evening," she said, her voice a blend of curiosity and caution. "Road's near closed. Not many out tonight." Ethan nodded, brushing the snow from his shoulders. "Truck's not liking the cold." Darlene gave him a long look, the kind of look that mothers give soldiers when they recognize something unspoken behind their silence. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No, ma'am. Just passing through." He poured himself a cheap cup of coffee, watching his reflection ripple in the dark liquid. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from memory, the kind that wakes you at night with the smell of gunpowder and screams that never fade. Outside, Shadow waited by the door, snowflakes collecting on his fur like tiny ghosts. Darlene glanced toward the glass, spotting the dog's silhouette. "Fine. Animal you got there." Ethan smiled faintly. "He's the best part of me that made it home." For a while they talked in half sentences. She told him her husband had passed 5 winters ago, heart failure on a storm night much like this one. Since then, she'd run the station alone, keeping it open for truckers who still believed in lonely roads. She offered Ethan a small sandwich from behind the counter, refusing payment with a firm hand. When he finally stepped back outside, the cold slapped him like an old enemy. The storm had grown heavier, the world swallowed in white. He rubbed Shadow's neck, the dog leaning into his touch with a low whine. "Yeah, I know, buddy. Feels like the world's frozen solid tonight." Ethan started toward the truck, but froze mid-step. Near the far edge of the parking lot, beneath a flickering streetlight, a small figure sat on the curb. The shape was trembling, wrapped in a thin jacket that barely reached the knees. "Stay," Ethan whispered to Shadow and approached slowly, boots crunching in the snow. It was a girl, no older than 10. She had tangled blonde hair sticking out beneath a wool cap and skin pale as frost. Her cheeks were red from cold, and she clutched a small orange kitten close to her chest, the creature mewing weakly beneath her jacket. Her lips were blue, but her eyes, wide, frightened, defiant, met his without flinching. "Hey," Ethan said softly, crouching a few feet away. "You okay, sweetheart? You shouldn't be out here." The girl's voice cracked. "My mom said she'd come back. She said she just needed to make a call." Ethan felt the words like a knife. He looked toward the empty highway, the endless line of headlights that never stopped. "How long's it been?" She hesitated, since it was light out. The child's name, he learned, was Lily Harper. She was small for her age, thin from too many missed meals, and her jacket was 2 sizes too big, sleeves covering her hands. The kitten's fur was matted, its eyes watery from cold. Ethan's chest tightened with something he hadn't felt in years, a protective instinct, older than fear. He stood, shrugged off his heavy military coat, and draped it around her shoulders. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you somewhere warm." She looked at him with suspicion, eyes darting to the scar on his cheek, the dog watching silently from the truck. "You're not one of those bad men, are you?" Ethan shook his head. "No, ma'am. I've seen enough bad men to know I don't ever want to be one." Lily hesitated, then allowed him to help her up. The moment her fingers touched his gloved hand, he could feel how cold she was, her small body shivering against the wind. Shadow padded forward, sniffed the kitten curiously, then sat beside Lily as if to guard her. Inside the truck, Ethan cranked the heater. The engine finally roared to life after a cough and a prayer. Lily sat in silence, staring at the storm beyond the windshield. The kitten nestled in her lap. "Where were you headed?" Ethan asked. "Don't know," she whispered. "Mom said we just needed to get away. She said people were mad at her. She said we'd find a new home." Ethan's throat tightened. The words sounded too familiar. Running, hiding, promising a home that never came. Outside, the snow thickened, wrapping the world in white silence. Inside, the soft hum of the engine filled the void. Lily's eyes began to close, exhaustion overtaking fear. Shadow rested his head against her knee, as if deciding that from now on, this fragile child was under his protection too. Ethan stared out into the night, the headlights catching the snow like falling stars. Somewhere deep in the quiet of his heart, something began to thaw. He didn't know it yet, but this night, the night he found a freezing girl at a gas station, would mark the beginning of everything that mattered. He whispered to himself, almost as a prayer. No one gets left behind again. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything. The storm had eased but left behind a world buried in silence. Ethan Cole rubbed his hands together, blowing into them to chase away the numbness. Inside the truck, the heater hissed weakly, filling the cab with the smell of old metal and damp wool. The little girl, Lily, still slept beneath his coat, her head resting against Shadow's thick fur. The dog didn't move, only watched her, his steady breathing forming tiny clouds against the frosted window. Ethan studied the two of them for a long moment. He saw too much of the battlefield in her stillness, the way children sometimes learn to sleep through fear because it was safer that way. When Lily stirred, the first thing she did was check if the kitten in her arms was alive. It gave a small, pitiful meow, and she smiled, a fleeting crack of light in the cold. "We should find some food," Ethan said quietly. She nodded without looking up. He drove slowly through Bozeman's outskirts. The streets were deserted, snowbanks taller than mailboxes, houses shuttered against the wind. Lily pressed her face to the glass, eyes tracing rooftops and telephone wires. "Does it always snow this much?" she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "In Montana? It's how the sky reminds us who's in charge." She didn't laugh. She was too young to understand the kind of humor that comes from surviving. At the first gas station that looked open, Ethan stopped for supplies. The clerk was a wiry man in his 30s, with a beard thick enough to hide most of his expression and a baseball cap pulled low. His name tag read Rick, and his narrow eyes darted between Ethan's scar and the girl standing close behind him. "You folks traveling far?" he asked, his tone friendly but edged with curiosity. Ethan could sense the man's suspicion, the kind people reserved for strangers with army duffels and no clear destination. "Just heading west," Ethan said evenly. "Truck's hungry, and so are we." Rick gave a grunt of understanding. "Ain't we all?" He handed over a couple of sandwiches and a jug of water, his calloused hands marked with small burns, the kind that came from years of working in places that never stopped running. When they returned to the truck, Lily tore the sandwich in half, feeding a piece to her kitten before taking a bite herself. Ethan watched her, realizing she hadn't once complained. Most kids would have cried for home or mother, but she sat there with quiet resolve, a small soldier in her own battle. "You don't talk much, do you?" he said. She shrugged. "Mom said people don't listen anyway." Ethan looked out the windshield. She might have been right about that. As the miles stretched on, mountains began to rise in the distance, their peaks hidden beneath clouds. The road wound upward through pine forests where the branches sagged heavy with snow. Lily dozed again, her breath fogging the window, and Shadow's head rested across her lap protectively. Ethan kept one eye on the road and one on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following them. Old habits from the military died hard. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed, or worse, get someone else hurt. By afternoon, the fuel gauge dipped near empty. They stopped at a roadside diner on the edge of the mountains, a place with a flickering sign that read, "Maggie's Place." The building leaned slightly to one side, and smoke curled lazily from its chimney. Inside, it was warmer than Ethan expected. The air smelled of coffee and bacon grease. A woman behind the counter turned as the bell rang. Maggie Turner was in her early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with auburn hair tied back and a scattering of freckles across her cheeks. Her hands were strong, the kind that knew both hard work and gentle care. "Well, you two look like you came out of a snow globe," she said with a smile. Ethan nodded politely. "Coffee for me? Something warm for the kid." Maggie poured 2 mugs of cocoa, sliding one toward Lily, who cupped it with both hands like it was treasure. "Poor thing," Maggie murmured. She yours? Ethan hesitated. No. Found her last night by the road. Maggie's smile faded. Lord have mercy. The world's gone upside down. She didn't press for details, though her eyes softened when she looked at the girl. Ethan could tell she was a mother once. There was a quiet sorrow in her movements, the kind that lingers long after loss. If you're headed into those mountains, she said after a while, watch the roads. There's an old bridge near Silver Creek that's half collapsed. Ethan nodded. Appreciate it. He paid what he could, though Maggie waved off half the bill. Soldiers don't pay full price here, she said, her tone matter of fact. Not the ones who still care enough to stop for a child. When they stepped back outside, the sky was already dimming. The snow reflected the last light of day like powdered gold. Lily tugged Ethan's sleeve. She was nice, she said. Maggie. Ethan nodded. Yeah, nice people are harder to find than warm food these days. The truck climbed higher into the mountains. Trees thinned, replaced by cliffs dusted white. Night crept in fast, the wind howling through canyons like a living thing. Lily grew restless, whispering to the kitten as if afraid silence might swallow them. Ethan told her stories to keep her calm, about the ocean he once saw when stationed near San Diego, about how the waves sounded like freedom when you'd been too long surrounded by sand and fire. She listened, her eyes glowing in the dim dashboard light. Did you ever get scared? She asked. Ethan thought about it, the memories pressing at the edges of his mind. All the time, he admitted. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about moving anyway. Hours later, when the fuel light began to blink, Ethan spotted a small cabin just off the road, half hidden behind a wall of pines. The roof sagged, smoke long gone from the chimney, but it looked like shelter. He parked the truck, grabbed a flashlight, and checked the perimeter. The snow crunched softly under his boots. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. A stone fireplace, a broken table, a pile of old firewood still dry enough to burn. As he worked to light the fire, Lily set the kitten near the hearth and watched it curl into a ball. Do you think my mom's looking for me? She asked suddenly. Ethan paused. The flame flickered in his eyes, making him look older than 30. I think, he said carefully, the world's got a strange way of separating people, but sometimes it brings new ones together for a reason. When the fire finally caught, the room filled with soft, orange light. Shadow stretched out beside Lily, tail thumping lazily. Outside, the snow fell again, muffling the world in peace. Ethan sat by the window, his rifle within reach, not out of fear but habit. He looked at the sleeping girl and thought, maybe this is what redemption looks like. Not medals or missions, but keeping one small soul safe through the night. That thought carried him into sleep as the fire whispered and the storm began again. The storm had passed, but the forest still wore its white shroud. Snow hung heavy on the pine branches, bending them toward the earth as if in prayer. Ethan Cole trudged through the knee-deep drifts, his breath fogging the air, his rifle slung across his shoulder. Behind him, Lily stepped carefully into his footprints, her small frame bundled in layers of borrowed clothing, the kitten's head poking out of her jacket. Shadow led the way, nose low, tail stiff, his ears twitching at every sound that broke the frozen stillness. They had been walking for 3 days since leaving Maggie's diner. The truck had given out somewhere along the ridge, its tires buried under snow. From there, they'd gone on foot, surviving on jerky, canned beans and whatever clean water Ethan could melt from snow. Lily never complained. She was pale and thin, her lips cracked from cold, but her resolve was stubborn, like a flame that refused to die. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. Ethan raised a hand to stop them, eyes narrowing. "Someone's been here," he murmured. They followed the scent uphill until the forest opened into a clearing. There, half hidden beneath snowdrifts and vines, stood a small wooden cabin. Its roof sagged under the weight of ice. One shutter hung loose, creaking softly in the wind. The chimney was black with soot, long cold. Ethan approached cautiously, scanning the ground. No fresh prints. "Looks empty," he said, though his tone carried no comfort. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and pine resin. Light filtered through cracks in the wall, illuminating a space both abandoned and preserved by the cold. A wooden table stood in the center, its surface etched with scratches and one phrase carved deep into the wood: "Whoever still believes, still lives." Ethan traced the letters with his glove. "A soldier wrote this," he said quietly. "I've seen that kind of handwriting before." The walls were lined with shelves holding empty jars, a rusted lantern, and a few faded photographs pinned beside a cracked mirror. One photo caught Ethan's eye: a man in uniform standing with a woman and a boy in front of this very cabin. The man's smile was faint, his posture rigid, as if the camera caught him between duty and peace. "He was military," Ethan muttered, noticing the insignia barely visible on the uniform. U.S. Army, 10th Mountain Division. Lily climbed onto a chair to look closer. "Do you think he lived here?" she asked. "Maybe," Ethan said. "Maybe he didn't come back." He moved through the cabin, checking each corner with a soldier's precision. The bedroom held only a narrow cot covered in moth-eaten blankets. A journal lay on the nightstand, pages curled with moisture. Ethan opened it carefully. Most of the writing had faded, but a few lines were still legible. "Winter 1984. The cold is worse this year. The forest keeps secrets. If anyone finds this, keep faith. God doesn't abandon those who listen." By dusk, he had a fire going. The flames cast long shadows across the walls, turning the cabin into something almost alive. Lily sat cross-legged near the hearth, drying her boots while Shadow rested with his head on her lap. The dog's eyes reflected the firelight, alert even in rest. Ethan boiled snow in an old pot, then handed Lily a tin cup of warm water. She accepted it with both hands, smiling faintly. "It's the best thing I've ever tasted," she said. Ethan chuckled. "That's because you earned it." Outside, night came fast. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the loose shutter. The fire crackled in answer, holding back the dark. Lily fed the flames small twigs and hummed softly, a tune Ethan didn't recognize. "My mom used to sing that," she said after a while, "when I couldn't sleep." Ethan looked up from the rifle he was cleaning. "It's pretty," he said. She nodded, eyes fixed on the fire. "Do you think she's okay?" He hesitated. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I do know you're safe now." A soft knock startled them both. Shadow leapt to his feet, growling low. Ethan raised his rifle and moved to the door, heart pounding. He opened it slowly. A man stood outside, snow clinging to his beard and coat. He looked to be in his 50s, tall but lean, his skin weathered by years of mountain wind. His eyes were sharp and pale, like ice under moonlight. "Didn't mean to scare you," the man said, raising his hands. "Saw smoke. Thought I'd check who moved into my cabin." Ethan lowered the rifle slightly but didn't relax. "Didn't know it belonged to anyone." The man smiled faintly. Name's Caleb Rhodes. Used to be Army. Guess you could say I've been on leave for about 20 years. He stepped inside uninvited, his movements calm but heavy with fatigue. His coat was patched, his gloves worn thin. Ethan recognized the quiet authority of someone who'd led men and buried them. Caleb's gaze swept the room, lingering on the photo. That's me, he said simply. And my wife and my boy. They're gone now. Long time gone. He took a seat by the fire, holding his hands to the warmth. Lily looked at him curiously. You lived here all alone? Caleb nodded. I did. Until the winter took more from me than I could give back. His voice cracked slightly before he hit it with a cough. Ethan introduced himself and Lily, explaining their journey in simple terms. Caleb listened without interruption. When Ethan finished, the older man nodded slowly. You've done right bringing the girl out of that storm. Not many would. He studied Ethan's scar. You were military. Marine, Ethan replied. Caleb grunted approvingly. Figures. You've got that look. The one that never quite leaves. They talked long into the night. Caleb spoke of the mountains, of old mines buried beneath the snow, and the people who vanished chasing gold or forgiveness. He had come here years ago after losing his family in a car accident, unable to bear the noise of the cities. I built this place to forget, he said quietly. Turns out you can't forget pain. You can only build a home big enough for it to live in. When Caleb finally retired to the cot, Ethan sat by the window, keeping watch. Lily slept beside Shadow, the kitten curled near her neck. Outside, the storm had returned, snow falling in endless sheets. Ethan whispered into the fire, whoever still believes, still lives. And for the first time in years, he found himself wanting to believe. A week passed since Caleb's arrival, and winter showed no mercy. The cold deepened each night until even the trees seemed to groan beneath the frost. Snow buried the cabin up to its windowsills, sealing them from the world. Inside, the 3 humans and 2 animals lived by the rhythm of the fire, feeding it, guarding it, and praying it would never die. Ethan had repaired the broken shutters and patched the leaks in the roof with scraps of canvas, but he knew the storm building beyond the ridgeline was different. It carried the smell of fear, the kind soldiers learn to recognize before the first bullet ever flies. Caleb stood by the door, his weathered hands tightening the straps of his old coat. This one's going to be bad, he muttered. His voice was low, rough like gravel dragged across steel. At 53, Caleb's face was carved by years of solitude, deep lines under his eyes, streaks of gray threading through his beard. He had the posture of a man who once commanded respect, but his gaze betrayed the loneliness of someone who had spent too long talking only to the wind. I'll check the traps before it gets worse, he said. Ethan shook his head. No, I'll go. You stay with Lily. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. Don't take too long, son. Outside, the wind howled like a beast uncaged. Ethan moved through the snow with Shadow close at his side, the dog's black coat dusted white, his breath coming out in clouds. The traps Caleb had set were buried, and most of them empty. He found only 1 rabbit, frozen stiff, a meager prize. Still, it was food, and in this weather, food was life. As he turned to head back, a gust of wind ripped through the pines, knocking him off balance. His boot slipped on a patch of ice, and suddenly the world tilted. He slid down the slope, snow exploding around him. The impact came hard and fast, a flash of white, then pain blooming along his ribs as he struck a buried rock. Shadow barked frantically above, his paws clawing at the edge of the slope. Ethan tried to move, but pain seared through his side. The cold was a living thing now, creeping into his blood. He could hear Shadow whining, and then the sound of snow shifting. The dog leapt down, landing beside him, tail whipping the air. "Easy, boy," Ethan rasped, gripping Shadow's collar. "We're okay. We're okay." But he wasn't. The world around him began to dim, the snow melting into gray shadows. Back at the cabin, Lily and Caleb waited. The fire had weakened, its glow faint. Lily crouched near it, feeding it scraps of wood. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "He's been gone too long," she whispered. Caleb glanced at the window, his jaw tight. "He'll make it. Marines don't freeze easy." Yet he reached for his coat all the same. Ethan wasn't sure how long he had been lying there when he felt teeth tugging at his sleeve. Shadow had grabbed the collar of his jacket, pulling, straining, growling, with effort. Inch by inch, the dog dragged him through the snow toward higher ground. Ethan could barely stay conscious. He thought of his platoon in Fallujah, of the night he promised a dying friend he'd keep fighting. The faces blurred together with the snow, and then there was only one clear image left. Lily's small hands gripping the blanket that night at the station, eyes filled with trust. That was enough. He forced his numb legs to move, crawling alongside Shadow. Together, man and dog fought the slope, breath by ragged breath, until the cabin's faint light appeared through the storm. Caleb spotted them first. He burst out of the cabin, coat flapping in the wind, and half-carried Ethan the rest of the way inside. "He's burning up," Caleb muttered, his rough hands trembling as he unbuttoned Ethan's frozen jacket. Lily knelt beside them, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please, please, don't let him die," she prayed, clutching Ethan's gloved hand. Shadow lay beside him, his fur soaked and chest heaving, refusing to move from his master's side. Caleb worked fast. He wrapped Ethan in blankets, poured hot water into a metal cup, and rubbed his arms to restore circulation. The cabin filled with the smell of smoke and wet fur. Ethan drifted in and out, hearing fragments of voices, Lily's crying, Caleb's steady murmurs, the crackle of fire struggling to survive. Somewhere in that haze, he felt warmth again, a spark. His fingers twitched. "Lily," he whispered hoarsely, "keep the fire going." She obeyed. The girl's small hands trembled as she fed logs into the flames, whispering words she'd heard her mother once say. "God, please don't take him. He saved me when no one else would." The flames caught suddenly, roaring to life, throwing gold light across the cabin walls. Caleb stared, his weathered face softening. "Faith," he murmured. "She's got more of it than we ever did." Hours passed. The blizzard battered the cabin, but the fire held strong. Lily sat beside Ethan, head resting against his arm. Shadow pressed close to her other side, his ears twitching every time the wind howled. Caleb watched from the table, sharpening his old knife out of habit. "You've got yourself a family now, soldier," he said softly, though Ethan couldn't hear him. When dawn came, the storm finally broke. Sunlight spilled through the cracks in the wood, turning the room golden. The fire had burned low but steady, its ashes still warm. Ethan stirred, his eyes opening to find Lily asleep against him. Her small fingers still clutched his sleeve. He smiled faintly, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Looks like we made it, partner," he whispered to Shadow, who thumped his tail in reply. Caleb poured him a cup of water and handed it over. "You're one lucky man," he said. "That girl prayed like the heavens themselves were listening." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. Maybe they were. Outside, the world glistened, a sea of white under a clear blue sky. The storm had cleansed everything, leaving behind silence and light. Ethan stepped outside with Shadow limping beside him, breathing in the crisp air. The mountains stood proud and endless, their peaks catching the sun. For the first time since returning from war, Ethan felt something close to peace. The fire had survived, and so had they. The storm had left behind a silence so pure it almost felt sacred. The mountains stood frozen in morning light, every tree glistening like it had been dusted with powdered glass. Smoke curled gently from the cabin's chimney, rising into a sky that had finally remembered how to be blue. Ethan Cole stepped outside, his boots crunching through the thin crust of new snow. The air was crisp enough to sting his lungs, but for the first time in years, the ache felt like proof of life rather than punishment. Behind him, Lily followed carefully, wrapped in an oversized coat that nearly swallowed her small frame. Her blonde hair spilled from beneath her wool hat, catching the light like strands of gold. Shadow bounded ahead, his paws leaving deep prints that trailed toward the tree line, while Caleb Rhodes stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame with a faint smile tugging at his weathered face. "You've got the look of a man reborn," Caleb said, his voice rough but kind. He looked stronger now, the fire having brought color back to his cheeks after nights of guarding the cabin. "Maybe I am," Ethan replied quietly. He gazed across the valley, where the snow stretched unbroken to the horizon. "Out there, I used to think survival meant staying alive, but now I think it means finding something worth living for." Caleb nodded. "You found it, son. She's standing right beside you." Lily smiled shyly, her gloved hand gripping Ethan's sleeve. The girl had changed, too. Her fear had softened into calmness, her voice steadier, her laughter, rare but genuine, spilled like sunlight through the cabin each morning. She had begun to help Caleb repair the place, patching walls with rags, melting snow for water, even gathering dry pine needles with Shadow trotting beside her like a loyal guardian. That morning, as they stepped into the clearing, a strange sound broke the stillness. A low hum, mechanical and distant. Ethan's instincts flared. He scanned the horizon until he saw a faint black dot against the pale sky, growing larger. A helicopter. His muscles tensed. Memories slammed into him. The roar of rotors over sand, the smell of gunpowder, the weight of commands shouted through static. He blinked hard and forced himself to breathe. Caleb noticed his stiffness. "Probably a ranger patrol," he said. "They don't usually come this far unless something's happened." The chopper circled once, then veered west, disappearing behind the ridges. But the noise had awakened something restless in Ethan, a reminder that the world beyond this mountain still existed, with its rules, questions, and unfinished wars. Later, when he carried wood back to the cabin, he found Lily sitting by the doorway, sketching in the snow with a stick. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She looked up, cheeks pink from cold. "Our house," she said simply. "And all of us. You, me, Shadow, and Mr. Caleb. See? The smoke means we're safe." Ethan crouched beside her, tracing her childish lines with a finger. "Looks perfect," he said softly. Inside, Caleb was working on something at the table, a small wooden cross carved from an old chair leg. His hands, though rough and calloused, moved with precision. "Figured we ought to mark the season," he said when Ethan entered. "Easter's not far off. Never thought I'd see another one." Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe we all get second chances." That evening, the three of them gathered by the fire. Lily held the cross close, whispering a prayer she remembered from her mother. The kitten, now plumper from Caleb's leftover jerky, purred in her lap. Ethan sat across from them, his face half in shadow. The flickering light drew out the scars on his skin, but in Lily's eyes, he saw no fear, only trust. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn tag from his military days. It was dull and bent from years of wear. "You know what this is?" he asked. Lily shook her head. "It's called a dog tag. Every soldier wears one. It tells people who we are, in case we can't speak for ourselves." He paused, then smiled. "But I think you should have it now. You earned it." Lily's eyes widened as she held the tag in both hands. "Does that mean I'm part of your team?" "You've been part of it since that night at the gas station," Ethan said, his voice low but warm. "And from now on, nobody gets left behind." Caleb raised his mug in silent approval. "That's a fine oath to live by." As the fire dimmed, Ethan stepped outside once more. The sky above the ridge had begun to glow faintly pink. He could see the first hints of dawn creeping across the horizon. Shadow padded up beside him, pressing his nose against Ethan's hand. The dog's fur was thick again, his eyes alert and proud. "You did good, boy," Ethan whispered. "We made it through." Shadow wagged his tail once, the sound soft against the snow. When the sun finally broke, it turned the entire valley into a sea of light. The ice shimmered like diamonds. Lily ran out of the cabin, laughing, her boots kicking up small clouds of powder. Caleb followed more slowly, his old bones stiff but his spirit light. Ethan watched them both and felt something shift inside him. A quiet, humbling realization that this was what home meant. Not walls or shelter, but people who refused to give up on one another. He turned to Lily and said, "From now on, this is our home, Lily. Ours to protect. Ours to keep warm." She looked up, smiling. The sunlight reflected in her blue eyes. "Then I'll never be scared again." Ethan crouched down and touched her shoulder. "You can be scared," he said. "That's human, but we'll face it together." Behind them, the cabin stood like a beacon in the endless white. The smoke from its chimney curled upward, merging with the brightening sky. Caleb leaned against the doorway, watching them with a fatherly pride he hadn't felt in years. "A soldier, a child, and a dog," he muttered to himself. The world could learn something from that. As the morning light grew stronger, Ethan felt a deep calm settle in his chest. The war within him, the guilt, the loneliness, the ghosts, seemed to fade with the melting frost. He knew there would be challenges ahead, that survival was still a fragile thing. But for the first time, he didn't dread tomorrow. He whispered a final promise to the wind, a vow carried beyond the peaks. No one gets left behind again. And in that vow, beneath the golden dawn, the cabin in the mountains became not just a shelter, but a sanctuary. Sometimes, miracles don't come as thunder or fire from heaven. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, in the shape of a little girl shivering in the snow, a scarred soldier learning to live again, or a loyal dog that refuses to give up when hope seems lost. On that frozen mountain, when death brushed close and the fire nearly died, something greater than chance kept the flame alive. Perhaps it was faith, the kind that moves unseen but holds the world together. Ethan, Lily, and Shadow didn't just survive the winter, they were transformed by it. They learned that God's grace doesn't always remove the storm. It gives us strength to stand within it. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. In our own winters, when life feels cold and silent, we must keep tending the small fire of love and faith until dawn returns. If this story touched your heart, if you too believe that miracles still walk among us in ordinary people, share this video with someone who might need hope tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the story reminded you of your own journey. And if you want to keep walking beside stories like this, stories that speak of courage, kindness, and the quiet presence of God, please subscribe to our channel. May the Lord bless you, warm your home, and keep your spirit steadfast through every storm that life sends your way.